Hey, Alicia Novin here. This video is going to be geared for hiring managers and interviewers, and today I'm going to cover 5 better ways to assess someone's technical ability in an interview. There we go. There are tons of articles out there that advocate for interviewers to get away from that old approach of asking candidates to write out algorithms, especially ones that are more academic, like sorting algorithms. And I'm in agreement with that because I think that especially the types of problems that people encounter these days are very, very different. And so what I wanted to do was give 5 different approaches that you can take to assess someone's technical ability without having them kind of recite something that they learned from memory, and is more reflective of what they would be doing on the job. Here we go with number 1. Really want to give an algorithmic question, first ask yourself what kind of problems you deal with on a day-to-day basis. And if it is research-based, if it is more on the academic side, or if you're just trying to come up with something that is really based on performance and optimization, then by all means you want to assess one's ability to think in that more theoretical space. But most of the time, for most products that are out there, the space of the types of challenges that we would encounter on a day-to-day basis are largely solved. And if it's not solved by the library that you're using already, you're probably just going to find a better solution faster using something like Stack Overflow. And the reason why that's better than having someone figured out in your own company is that that solution that's there on Stack Overflow has been reviewed by many, many people, and there's a reason why that highest rated solution is the highest rated solution. So you don't want to necessarily find people who are uniquely skilled at devising really fast or really elegant algorithms. Instead, you want to find people who are really, really good at implementing and integrating. And that could be with any kind of library, it could be with any kind of code base, or it could be with code they find on Stack Overflow. So you want to ask questions that assess their ability in understanding those kinds of questions. The analogy I like to give here is that you don't need to be Leonardo da Vinci to appreciate the complexity and the depth of the Mona Lisa. And in the same way, you don't need to, really be able to create your own complex algorithm to be able to use them effectively, or understand how they should be used. So I think when you're in an interview setting, especially given how candidates can be so nervous, you don't want to turn away good people just because you're asking them to prove a skill set that they're not necessarily going to be using on the day-to-day basis on the job. So instead of asking them those more complicated algorithm questions, ask them things that are very, very relevant to what they would be faced with. So things like, imagine that you have a collection of objects and you want to filter the list down to a smaller list based on one kind of property. How would you do that? Or you might ask them to, again, given a collection, find the total count of objects that match a certain criteria. Or work with multi-dimensional arrays or nested objects and have them kind of iterate over those things. Those are very, very common kinds of things that we do on a day-to-day basis, and they're not as algorithmically complex as these kinds of things. And these will actually help you see what their actual talents are going to be, and it's going to be far more relevant to the types of work that they'll be doing with you. If you're sensing that a candidate has some ability, but you don't quite know how deep that ability is because they're nervous or they're just not communicating very well, one thing to try out is asking them to diagram out a solution. And that can be, a software design kind of problem, architectural diagram, something that allows them to show in an illustrative way how they think through a problem. And as they talk through it, you can ask them for more details, you can zoom in on a certain area, and just allow them to kind of flesh that out as they're talking through it. And just by having them do a diagram and do something different than writing code, it'll put them in a bit of a different mindset. Now, the questions that you ask them, you want to make sure that you're asking them questions that are ultimately going to be relevant, again, to the role that they're interviewing for. So, if they're there to write code, don't focus too much on the infrastructure aspects of the diagram that they have. Ask more code-related questions, like ask about some of the internals of a class that they've defined, or how are they parsing certain information. And again, you want to keep it so that they're only really talking in terms of the diagram and not necessarily getting to writing code, But if they can just talk through and describe their solution in an illustrative way, that'll give you a better sense of their technical ability without having them have to prove their knowledge just based off what they can produce in terms of code on a whiteboard in an interview session. A completely different approach is to simply ask the candidate to walk you through a project of theirs. And you can pull open their GitHub and pick a project that's in there and find some interesting code, especially code that might show that they made a very intentional decision in structuring it one way versus another, and ask them about that. Ask them why they decided to make that a singleton pattern, or whatever it might be. And the point though is that it is their code, so they'll be a lot more comfortable with being able to explain it. Again, candidates are going to be nervous, so they'll probably find some areas that they'll be sheepish about, or they'll be embarrassed to show because maybe they cut corners or maybe it was sloppy. But that's a perfect opportunity to ask them about that and say, it's clear that you probably cut some corners here, but let's talk through why. What were the choices that you made, and what were the constraints for you to have done that? And if you had the opportunity and the time, what would you do differently, and how would you improve that? This gives them something that's very specific that they worked on, so that they can actually point to and recall based off of the experience that they had while working on it, to then give you a much more in-depth answer, and again, just allow you to better assess the technical skill. Most software development roles are very, very collaborative. And most of the problems that we tackle, we don't tackle in isolation. And so getting a sense of one's ability to collaborate with someone else is a really good way of seeing what technical skills they have. So rather than put them in the driver's seat where they're the one writing all the code on the whiteboard, why don't you put yourself in that position? Write out some code and have them guide you. So have them catch some possible errors before you make them. Have them, call out certain design considerations that you might want to factor in as you write it out. By putting yourself at the whiteboard and doing that part yourself, you're taking away all of the weight and anxiety that comes with, wanting to make sure that you get the syntax right, or, if you can't remember the order of certain parameters in substring, for example, whatever it might be. By having you be the one demonstrating and writing the code out for them, they can then focus on collaborating with you and problem solving and finding the areas that are actually ultimately going to show you whether or not they have a strong technical ability or not. And again, another approach is to ask them to imagine that you are an entry-level junior person that is being mentored by them, and ask them to teach you something that you don't know. And it doesn't matter whether or not you actually know about that thing. It's more about, one, figuring out what they select as part of that thing that they want to teach you. And I'll cover more of that in a second. But the second one is that as they describe it, as they talk through it, you'll hear about a lot of things that they think are important in providing that description, in teaching someone about it. And so that'll give you a different way of assessing their technical ability. Going back to the first part about why they chose the thing that they chose to teach you, there's a lot to unpack there as they talk through it, because if they've researched it recently, if it's something that is at the forefront of their mind, there's a reason why it's there. And it might be something that excites them, it might be something that they're passionate about, or it might be that they were recently trying to solve a problem and they were researching something and came across this solution and went down this long pathway of trying to figure it out. And so as they describe it, ask them at the end why they picked that as the thing they wanted to teach, and what kind of things that what kind of problems they were faced with. Because again, that's just yet another way where you'll start to hear what kind of capabilities they have and how they think through problems in a technical way. I'm excited to see more and more hiring managers prep their interviewees before the actual interview. So they'll tell them what kinds of questions they'll be asked. But the thing is, you don't want to just say that you should prepare for a coding question at the whiteboard, because that's still too ambiguous and it doesn't really give a lot of opportunity for the candidate to be confident. And what they'll turn to would be those programming interviews exposed kind of books that cover all the coding questions that typically get asked, or they'll research your company and they'll see what kinds of questions you've asked in the past. And so you end up getting a candidate who's very prepared for very specific types of things and not really showing you what they are truly capable of. But if you ask them to prepare in the sense that you'll be asking them to walk you through a project of theirs on GitHub, if you ask them to prepare by covering something that they recently learned with you and teaching you about it, because they own the code, because it was their experience, they can prepare in a different way and be able to give you a lot better and more direct kind of responses in the interview. So it'll have a bit more confidence to it, and you'll be able to get to the root of their ability a lot faster. And so I think that's really important, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that candidates are not nervous and they are in a position to perform their best. And some people might respond to that by saying, or wondering why it's their job to put a candidate at ease, and they would much rather take an approach of just asking the question, asking them to code something on the whiteboard, and the candidate's either going to pass or fail. And it's not their job to give them hints or elaborate or assist them in any kind of way. But in response to that, I'd say that if you're thinking that way, know that your team is only going to end up being a team of individuals that work in that kind of way, that are confident in interview settings and can really rapidly respond to those kinds of questions very confidently, but otherwise you don't know where their other weaknesses might be. And you don't want to have a team that's all made up of the same type of personality. You want to have some variability. You want to have people who have different strengths and different weaknesses, because your users are going to be different. Your business problems and challenges, the landscape is going to change and shift, and having people with varied experiences and varied ways of communicating is really important, and it's going to strengthen your team to have that, as opposed to a team that is comprises of people who are all working in the exact same way. It's arguably not more collaborative, and it's going to run into or compound the types of problems that they do have. So by having that variance among your individuals, you're going to have a stronger team overall. So I hope you'll consider taking this approach. Definitely would love hearing your feedback if you've tried this and what works for you, or if you have other ideas, leave them in the comments. And lastly, I'll tell you about my podcast called Increments, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. And it's basically a podcast that is focused more on how we, in the coding technology world, can focus more on just our individual growth and the types of challenges and problems that we want to focus on as we do try to grow in our careers. I hope you'll check it out, and thanks a lot. Bye.